All right, it says the stream is live, so I guess this is my time. So, hi everyone. My talk today is making friends with reviews, providing great feedback. My name is Ken Dale. I'm a senior software engineer at Microsoft. I work on the Learn platform, so it's learn.microsoft.com. You can find me on all the internet places at KendaleIV and on the Blue Sky that everybody seems to be using these days, at KendaleIVthere.com, which is also my domain name as well. So to get started, I like to think that the talk title itself kind of has two different meanings. First, you're doing a good job with reviews kind of as a reviewer. Like you're reviewing the code, you're making the necessary changes, you're asking the necessary questions. It's all about the code. But then there's also the other side of just relationships and people and kind of making friends with folks, forming positive relationships, forming team bonds, like those sort of things. So just as a general outline for the talk, I'm going to go through just providing that feedback in the form of comments, and just some other points of just kindness, empathy, being pragmatic, some general pull request review strategies, and just a brief talk about just refactoring in general. We'll look at some pull request examples that I created of a not so good pull request and one that's a little bit better. And the pull request isn't like the reviews of them. And then we'll just summarize up everything that we just covered here today at the end. So, what are reviews? I like to think of reviews as just looking at code and ultimately figuring out if there's anything that needs to be changed. Like, is there anything that could be made better? Or is there a better way to do something? Is there, one or more critical problems with the code? Like maybe there's a small Boolean logic flaw or just something minor. But we're ultimately looking to kind of review something someone else wrote and kind of provide our own feedback and insights into, what that looks like. Or it doesn't even necessarily have to be code specifically. It can even be things like Word documents. So I end up writing a decent amount of just tech designs and things like that in the form of Word documents. And then you can circulate those around to folks and they can read the document, comment right in the Word document, and you can have a dialogue and a discussion that way. So before you even get to the process of writing code, you can kind of have a nice first pass into just your overall thinking and thought process. A lot of the advice I'm going to provide is mainly centered around the idea of code review, but you could really think of it as reviewing any sort of materials, whatever the case may be. So, story time. Imagine if you're a developer and you're joining a new team and maybe you're even joining a new company at the same time. And it's a potentially scary time to go from one company to another, or even just if it's your first job, starting out with that new team and that new whatever the case may be. And you're really excited to contribute, but you're also kind of nervous because you haven't worked with these group of folks before and you don't really know the expectations and all of those things. And you work really, really hard on your first thing and you put a lot of work together. And even though it might not look like it in terms of your actual output, like you worked really hard on this thing and you submit your first pull request, which is just your way of saying, here's some code, please review this. And for whatever reason, you just have a really not so good experience. And it's not really a fun place to be. And if it's a workplace team environment, then it might lead to that person, not having a good experience and maybe not wanting to contribute or being kind of like scared to contribute in the future for fear of making mistakes and being made to feel bad about it. It's one thing to make a mistake, but it's another thing to like make somebody feel bad about making a mistake. So that's not really a place you want to be in as a person who's having your stuff reviewed. And if it's the case of an open source project, like if somebody receives that kind of review, they might not want to contribute to your stuff in the future simply because they just didn't have that positive interaction with you. But there's also the other side where imagine, if you will, that you're an experienced dev and you're ultimately looking for a promotion at your workplace. And everyone recognizes that you do really excellent work. But at the end of the day, if folks don't really like working with you simply, and it might not be that they don't even like working with you, it might be that they're like scared of the things that you're going to say and the unhelpful feedback that you might be providing, it might ultimately limit your impact as that experienced dev looking for a promotion. Like whenever promotion cycles roll around and those kind of management discussions are happening, if they like reach out to other folks on the team to get their opinion, like they might not have a really favorable opinion in terms of your role kind of and your level of impact being expanded across that organization. So I feel like it's important for both sides to, do a really good job in this area. And why do we care? I feel like it's important to build those strong bonds between people. And I mean, especially in a workplace, like you don't necessarily have to be the best of friends with everyone, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a lot more fun for you as a person if you're having those strong positive interactions. And it's kind of the personal side, but professionally, it can also just you have a greater impact and can ultimately lead to your own personal career growth. And how do we give good pull request reviews? One of the first things I like to think about is just trying to comment on positive things you see. Most pull request reviews, and I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else, is you're only focusing on the things that you don't like or the things that you think need to be changed. I think sometimes simply providing some positive feedback can go a long way to make the rest of your feedback a little more palatable for the person who might be reading it. So if somebody does a really good job with a description in their pull request, that's the first thing you read at the top, and they have like repro steps and like how to test it and how they went about it and what problem it solves and like all of these details, like that's a really easy way to provide some initial positive feedback. And it isn't to say you should run around every pull request and simply slap on your positive feedback and not really take into account like what the pull request really is. Like don't do it in like a disingenuous way. And at the end of the day, if you can't really find something nice to say, like you don't need to invent something, but I feel like can go a long way to have like that genuine positive interaction of saying something that you see that you like and you hope that that person continues doing. Another thing you can do is you can comment on research you did to confirm something. So I find sometimes I'll just open up .NET Fiddle or a tool like that, and I'll just write a really quick C# example to see if the code's really doing what you think it might be doing. So if you're using link and you're calling the distinct operation on link, is it actually comparing it the way you think it is, or is it comparing it the other way that's not the way that you think it might be doing simply by reading it? And firing up some quick console project, however you'd like to do that, you can kind of confirm the behavior. And after you do that, you can just leave a quick comment that says to the author that like, hey, you did the right thing, great job. It's some positive feedback as well. And you're kind of signaling that to the other reviewers that, this is also done as well. So it's another opportunity to kind of give that positive feedback. And you can also just comment to ask questions, which I feel like is a lot of the meat of a pull request review. And when you do that, try to use approachable language. And since I said approachable language, what is that? To me, approachable language is simply taking phrases like you should and things that just sound instructive and not coming alongside someone to work with them, and just try to eliminate those from your vocabulary. So instead of you should, maybe we can say something like we should to kind of have that collective ownership of whatever that thing is. Or could we, or let's, or what do you think? And it's like, yeah, what do you think uses the word you, but it's asking a question. It's not telling the person what they should or must do. Even if you know that it's 100% unequivocally wrong and needs to be fixed, you don't need to like, you must fix this. Like, you can still say it in a little bit more of a gentler way. And I feel like that can go a long way in just providing, some good feedback for that person and just leading to an overall positive experience. And it kind of goes hand in hand with just being kind. I think it's important to remember that code is very much about technical accuracy, and the code doesn't care if you wrote it wrong, and it will happily run the wrong thing. But at the same time, yes, the code needs to be technically accurate and correct, and it needs to do all the right things. But as a human, you can also communicate that it's technically not accurate in a kind way. And one of the ways you can do that is simply by offering to help, or, for lack of a better way to say it, doing the work for the person that you're reviewing. So GitHub and Azure DevOps as well have the triple backtick suggestion feature that enables you to comment on a line of code and suggest an edit for something you like to, see changed. So rather than simply commenting on something that isn't right, you can also provide a way for the pull request author or other contributors to just point and click and add your change to their pull request. And in a more extreme example, you can even make a pull request to the branch that is powering the person's pull request as well. I don't use this often, and I can't think of even the last time I've done this, but it is another tool in your toolbox if you want to, be able to submit a large body of work that goes beyond just modifying a few lines and such. And a lot of it just boils down to empathy. So empathy is kind of just this idea of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And, you just have to think and kind of just reason about what that looks like. If it's somebody who's, a new member of your team and they just don't know how you do things, like imagine that you're a new person on the team and you just got there, and try to just approach things through that sort of lens. For me personally, if I like to build some empathy, I try to think about a language that I'm not familiar with and pretend I'm kind of just reviewing things in that language. For me, that's Python. So I've done a number of, or not a number, but enough of a few interviews before. And like as the interviewer, like the code examples that the folks are providing are in Python. And I'll be the first to admit I know very, very little about Python. So when I'm asking questions, I'm looking to gain their technical expertise with like the language, kind of trying to feel things out. But at the same time, I'm also trying to like figure things out for myself and get my own answers so we can like get through everything we need to get through. So yeah, an easy empathy builder. Just pretend that you're reviewing something in a language that you're not familiar with. And while you're doing all these things, it's also important to just be pragmatic. Look for ways that you can approve a pull request, not for ways that you can like shoot it down or refuse to merge it or just outright reject it. So it doesn't mean that you need to like let things in that have problems. At the end of the day, if there's a security issue or a major logic flaw or something that like introduces something otherwise unequivocally bad to the pull request, like, yeah, you shouldn't approve and merge those things. But at least with Azure DevOps, you can approve with suggestions if there's something in it that doesn't really need to be fixed. Like maybe there's a small spelling error or something in a README file, but everything else looks great. Or, some other minor formatting thing. Or, you're able to still signal that the pull request looks good, but hey, maybe we can also fix these things as well. And just in terms of being pragmatic, like maybe this isn't the best time to, if somebody's rushing to meet a deadline and there's small formatting things, like maybe we just don't worry about it this time and just be pragmatic, move forward, and, we can always address things later because code can be changed at any time for any reason. And small stuff. Since I mentioned spelling and grammar, well, now I mentioned grammar and formatting, and if I see these things in pull requests, I still like to fix them because I feel like they're still important. Like even if it is a code comment, if there's a spelling error, like code can be hard enough to read sometimes, and if somebody gets distracted by a spelling error, like that can kind of throw someone off. So if you see something, like we can fix it. But at the end of the day, if you prefix it with nit, like NIT, kind of like signaling that something is a nitpick, like a small thing, not really a big deal, and then you mention what that thing is, I feel like that can go a long way to building a positive interaction when you feel like somebody's just beating you up for catching spelling errors and things like that you might not have caught. And it's really easy to do. I mean, I don't even have a spell check thing on Visual Studio currently, so it's like I could just as easily commit a spelling error as anyone else. But prefixing it with nit kind of makes it just feel a little bit better if you're getting those things as the author. And it's also a really good opportunity to use that suggestion feature. So you're making the fix as the person reviewing, and then they can just point and click their way to victory and merge that change into their pull request and just have it integrated in. And just some general review strategy. It's important to think beyond the surface. When you're reviewing code, a lot of the times if you're just scrolling through GitHub quickly, you'll see the lines that are changed, and you'll see a little bit above and you'll see a little bit below, but you don't see anything else. So you have to start thinking about different things, kind of just zoom out and just think about things that if something accepts user data, like does that data look like the way that it's supposed to? Are there security concerns with the code? And it's not going to necessarily point with a big giant arrow that says this is a security concern. It might be something that you need to think through. And if you're accepting user data and you're going to be putting that user data directly back on the website, are there things like content safety concerns that you need to be concerned about? So it's things that aren't directly in the code that you're reviewing, but it's things that you try to think about those as well. And those are good opportunities for things to review as well. And as you're doing that, also try to look beyond the local context of where you're looking. So yeah, you see the lines that are being changed and you see immediately above and immediately below, but there might be some other interesting things in that particular file or even other files in that repository that you might find interesting. So you can look up, look down, like maybe there's some constant or something at the top of the file that you might find interesting and maybe should have used in your code. But if you're not looking for those opportunities beyond just the local context window that you get to see on GitHub, you might kind of miss those opportunities as a reviewer. And refactoring. This one can kind of be a touchy one because there's one side of the argument where we should never copy paste code in the system anytime ever, and there should only be one representation of anything ever. That's one stance on one side. And then there's also the other idea where, well, we can copy paste as many times as we want. And at the end of the day, does it really matter? Whatever, we'll just copy paste, get it done, ship it, and move on with life. And I feel like neither of those stances are necessarily the best thing. And sometimes having code copying and pasted might be better than forming the wrong abstraction, trying to remove that duplication. So it's a good opportunity to be pragmatic and recognize that, like, maybe this isn't even the point in time that we think refactoring is a good idea. Like, if you know the other person's rushing to meet a deadline and you're talking about refactoring something that doesn't really need to be done right now, like, that can kind of have a bad taste. So I think a lot of it is just being pragmatic at the same time. And the role of AI. Everybody's, we're all talking about AI and experimenting with AI tools and seeing how AI can help all of our workflows and writing code. And AI can do a pretty decent job of actually reviewing your code as well if you just plug in any sort of AI tools. I mean, I don't know what all's available on GitHub for that kind of integration. I don't manage that stuff myself, but if you're able to just plug in those kind of tools and get suggestions from the AI for things that might be missed or potential problems, it's something you should look into and take advantage of. But then there's also other tooling that's not AI as well, like things like formatting and, just any other thing. If it's important to you, maybe it's something you can automate during code review. And if code formatting is an utmost important thing for whatever project you're working on, if you can have that automated where the build simply fails when the expectations aren't met, it allows more human focus on things that are actually important and impactful, not just a bunch of comments for nits about formatting. And that's just a lot of friction on both sides of the person who's writing the code and the person that's reviewing the code. And it's just not fun for anyone involved. But if it's all automated with a bot and, that's just telling you that it's not quite working out the way it's supposed to, that can kind of go a long way as well. But I think also with the formatting thing, it's also important to be pragmatic. And is it really important for the thing you're working on? Like, formatting is probably very important for certain open source projects like the .NET Runtime and things like that. But if you're working on your web app with your small team, like, maybe that extra line in between two statements, maybe it's really not a big deal and something you should hold up a pull request over. And at this point, we're going to stop with the slides and we're going to go look at some example pull requests. So I created some interesting pull requests. The first one being a not so nice review. I called it a harsh review. So I'll first we'll look at the code file in isolation before we get to all the huge amount of comments. So we just have here just a single file called print numbers. It's a C# file. It's a class called print numbers. It's got a single instance method that doesn't return anything, so it's void here, and its name is print. And inside here, it counts from 0 to 9 inside this for loop, and it simply pumps out the numbers 0 through 9 to the console, each on their own lines. So pretty simple. It's a total of 10 lines. You'd think that there might not be a lot to review and there might be not a lot to talk about, but you would be wrong. So if someone was, providing more of a harsh review, you could, land at the conversation tab here, and you can immediately see that there's an 11 here. So it's like, there's only 10 lines of code and there's 11 comments. Like, really? So first we are met with, please address my comments. Like, not really interested in having a conversation, not really interested in any sort of formality or being nice at all, really. Just add a PR description. It's blank. Amend your commit to include the same text. Like, is that really important to have it in there? Like, how does someone do that? Yeah. So as we're moving down, we can see there are no tests for this method. Please add them. Like, we're not going to we're just skipping all the niceties and formalities, and this method isn't invoked. Like, does that matter? Is that coming in another pull request? Is this going to be library code that's going to be shipped, so nothing is directly going to execute this? I don't know. We didn't know. We didn't ask those questions. We simply made a statement that it's just not being invoked. And this method could be static. Yes, it could be, but is that important? Like, don't know. This class could be static. Sure, yes, it technically could be if it just had static methods on it, I guess, but is it really the most important thing? Here's a comment about the requirements, and it just kind of goes on and on, that this shouldn't only count to 9, it should accept it as a parameter, and hey, move this system to a using. Is that important? Maybe, maybe not. And this file doesn't end with a new line. Like, okay. Like, I feel like that's probably the biggest formatting nit. Include a namespace, and there's no documentation. And rename this, rename the method, rename the file, update the PR title. I mean, this one's at least a question. Will users see this? So if you were somebody who submitted this really simple code example, and imagine, if you will, that you worked really hard on this, and this was a real work, or yeah, I mean, if it's a workplace thing, if this was your real work project and you submitted something that had a small number of lines, it seemed like a small change, and you just got more comments than lines of code, like, it doesn't feel really good, and you might be hesitant to really want to contribute again in the future. And at the end of the day, like, these are all public comments. Anybody reading this, like, might see that, you got a lot of harsh feedback, and maybe you just didn't do the best job type thing. Or at least that's how you might feel as the person who wrote the code. And it's just not a fun place for anyone to be in. So conversely, let's look at how we can do things a little bit better. So this one's a little more complicated, so I had some things to talk about. So let's first look at those code files in isolation again, without comments. So we'll just ignore the comments for now, and we'll just skip to the magical land of code. So I basically wrote something. It's a single file called SQL operations. SQL being a database that you can write, SQL, SQL language against, and you can just run some stuff to get stuff into the database or read stuff out of the database. So in this case, we have SQL operations with a single method called select, which is basically the way of retrieving things out of the database. And then it allows you to provide an optional condition. And if this condition is provided, then it simply adds it to the end of the SQL query. And I know what you're thinking, and you're absolutely right, and we'll get there. And then it just spins up a reader and reads that data and returns it to whatever called this select method. So it might return whatever's in test column here. It might return, if the values were ABC, this method would return, ABC as well. And then there's also a method here for putting the data into the database. So it inserts into this test table a parameterized value and takes that value and just saves it into the database. So just raw ADO.NET code, not using any libraries or anything to abstract it, just select and insert. Now we'll go look at the tests that I wrote before we get to looking at the comments. So these are just XUnit tests using the temporary DB library that enables you to have a spin it up, throw it away, local test database. So here it kind of creates that database, and it creates the SQL operations, which is the thing we're writing the tests for, since it's SQL operations tests here. That's what we're testing. So as part of spinning up the tests, we want to create that table in the database. And when we're done doing the tests, we want to delete that table from our test database as well. And we have some different methods here. First, we want to test that the select method works without providing that optional condition. Then we check if it works with providing that optional condition. And finally, we check that we can insert the items that we expect into the database and that they're actually getting inserted into the database. So the code's not super important. It's more about just having a high-level understanding. So when we read the comments, things make sense. So if we come all the way back up here to the conversation, and this was what you'd be greeted with as you open this page, and you can see I have the title here, to add this and its associated test project. And here the reviewer said, I left comments throughout. There's a security concern we must address. But then it also asks a question. Instead of saying, you must add a description or please add a description, it's just asking a question like, could we just add a description too? Like, just feels a little bit friendlier. But then at the same time, we're also being firm with things like if there's a real and present problem, like a SQL injection issue, like that's something we absolutely need to fix and take care of. But beyond providing this information, it also provides kind of a way that you might fix it. And yes, it doesn't provide a point and click way to fix it where somebody can just merge it in. It also gives the author kind of something to go off of and maybe do a little bit more research and to understand the problem. And maybe, depending on, who you think might be reading this, maybe you would even want to link to some sort of article about SQL injection in this case. Like maybe if you think that would be helpful for the other folks reading it and for the author of this pull request. And this is where I mentioned earlier about doing that research and then commenting that you did that research. So here it's saying, good job using iasync lifetime here rather than iasync disposable, as XUnit v2 doesn't call async disposable. So this is an interface here, this iasync lifetime. Putting that on there signals that you have to satisfy everything that's in that interface. And .NET has had the iDisposable, but there's also an iasync disposable. So one might think that you would just simply use the iasync disposable. But if you did that in the context of XUnit, apparently that's not the right way to do it, and you need to use that iasync lifetime. But if you weren't reading the documentation and you confirmed that the author did it the right way, this is a good time for that positive feedback to also say that, hey, I looked this up and confirmed it as well. Great job. And, here's the research that I did as well to confirm this behavior. And here it's saying, the database is being reused between tests. And it's not returning the database state to the original after each test. And yeah, ideally it would be isolated from others, but then it also asks a question. Like, it gives a way to potentially fix the problem. Like, do you think dropping and recreating the tables would be a good idea? Or is there a different solution we could implement? So it kind of gives that feeling that you're willing to work with the person and kind of give them some thoughts, but you're not kind of dictating what absolutely needs to happen in this particular case. Because there might be a better solution out there that you might not even think of, but you were just the person who, thought about the state leaking between the tests. And here's where I mentioned, prefixing things with knit. So at the end of the day, this particular item is test code. It's not the actual code. So, what do you think about refactoring to, I closed this by accident. There we go. So the knit here being that multiple values could be inserted in a single database call. But I'm also recognizing it doesn't really matter because it's a test and it has 2 items and it is test code. So yes, we could eliminate a database round trip, but it's not really as important as the actual like code being reviewed that's not the test code. So we can prefix that with a nit to kind of signal to the author that, yeah, it's probably not that big of a deal. And here's an opportunity to refactor some of the test code. So it's, what do you think about refactoring to reduce duplication? Because I know in some cases, some people have, there's dry, don't repeat yourself. But sometimes with test code, that taken to an extreme can actually make the tests really difficult to understand. And sometimes having tests be a little bit more verbose, and even if it means copy pasting tons and tons of stuff, like some people prefer to work that way, and like I can totally respect that approach as well. So it's kind of asking the question about refactoring rather than saying these lines are the same, we should absolutely do this. So again, it's just about having a dialogue, being kind, and signaling that you're willing to like work with someone and not just dictate things that just have to be done. And here's a comment about this is the real code for the insert method, and would potentially want to insert multiple values. Like, what does that look like? So we could potentially change it to accept multiple values. But it's also asking the question, would this potentially be called multiple times in a row? I mean, yes, this is a contrived example, but maybe this method would only ever be called one time, and it doesn't make sense to ever call it more than once. So rather than saying like, you can absolutely accept multiple things and you should absolutely do that, like, let's first kind of ask the question to begin with and have that dialogue. And here's kind of just a helpful tip for the author that, hey, constructing all of this data in memory coming out of the database, like this could get really expensive. This new list that takes everything in the database that's being pulled out and putting it directly into memory. So if it's, a few items, maybe not a big deal. But if it's like a gigabyte worth of data and it's taking that and loading it into server memory, and then if that's potentially scaled across a bunch of different requests, that could very quickly overwhelm server memory and not something we'd want to do. So, but it's also saying, but if we anticipate large amounts of data. So it kind of gives that opportunity to have that dialogue and work together for a resolution. And this is what it looks like to be on the receiving end of the suggested change, that triple backtick suggestion feature. So if you like something that somebody's written, you can just go to commit suggestion, hit commit changes, and then that change is now part of your pull request. So here it says, someone says, the reviewer says, we could use async here, but it's also recognizing that like maybe the person has already thought about the fact that there's an async ability and maybe they've chose not to use it. Like, for all we know, they could have ran benchmark.net for their particular use case and found that the non-async version performs better in the environment that they're in for the particular use case they have. So it's recognizing, that is a possibility. It's not something that's saying like, oh, you clearly just missed the fact that you could have used async and didn't. Like, kind of having that, ongoing dialogue. Then there's just another one here as well, with that same kind of general feeling as well. So at this point, we will switch back and we'll summarize things up, and then I'll take any questions. So let's switch back to here. We're back at our examples. So we looked at pull requests that weren't so good, the sad, and a little bit better, hopefully, as the happy. So just in summary, look for ways to have positive comments for the things that you're saying. And it doesn't mean to have some sort of like disingenuous positive comment that you're just stamping on a pull request. Like, it should really mean something and you should really mean it. And maybe you don't always have something to comment on that you like on a pull request. But I feel like it goes a long way to just building bonds with other folks when you have something positive to say and something you like and a behavior that you want to see, continued in the future. And you can comment on that research that you did. So in terms of code, if you run down something and make a small console app to confirm something, you could even put a link to that small console app, if it's like .NET Fiddle, that the person could go and run it and confirm that it's doing the right thing. And, you can link that in terms of a positive comment as well. And you can comment to ask questions. But when you do, use approachable language. So for me, this looks like you should, or you must do this, like try to avoid those kind of things. And I feel like if you got nothing else from today's talk, take the word you and substitute for the word we. And I feel like that can go a long way to making a pull request review just feel nicer. Because at the end of the day, when you use the word we, it's kind of signaling this collective ownership. And if you use you, it can kind of feel accusatory. So if you had one tip from today, let that one be it. And it goes, hand in hand with just being kind, and you're able to offer to do the work for the person with that triple backtick suggestion feature. And, you can even submit a pull request to a pull request branch if you, want to do that, have the ability to just open up your IDE and make all sorts of changes and submit them to the person to kind of help out. And it's important to have empathy, kind of just thinking, putting yourself in that other person's shoes. And I like to do that by just imagining that I'm just unfamiliar with the thing that is being reviewed. So if it's C# code, pretend it's Python, at least for me anyhow. You might be way better at Python than me. And with all of this advice, just be pragmatic. We're not here to just, we need to be technically accurate, but we can also be pragmatic at the same time. We can look for ways that we're able to approve a pull request. But at the end of the day, if you need to be firm if you can't. Like if there is a security issue, like it shouldn't be something you approve and maybe comment on. Like, no, you absolutely need to comment on that. But you can also be kind at the same time when you're leaving those comments. And when you're using the suggestion feature, well, if you're leaving small things like spelling and grammar, I feel like those are still absolutely important. But if you prefix them with knit, kind of signaling that they're really not a big deal, that can go a long way to just making everything feel nicer for everyone involved. And when you're reviewing pull requests, think beyond the surface. So zoom out, think about other things that aren't the lines. Look up, look down, look at the top of the file, look in other files, think about things like content safety and security and availability and all of those different things that aren't necessarily the code that you're looking at. And with refactoring, as in all things, just try to be pragmatic in terms of, is this the best time to be suggesting this activity, or maybe it's not. So if you have any questions, I'm at KendaleIV. This is my domain name as well, and I'm on Blue Sky at KendaleIV.com. And with that, I hope you're having a great conference experience, and I'm just looking to see what the question situation. I don't know if there's. Yeah, so if you have any questions, I guess just follow up with me on Discord or any of the other socials, and I'd be happy to talk with you about them. So I appreciate your time today, and take care. Thank you. Oh, I see questions start here. Oh, okay. I'm on my phone now, so what? So a question I see is, what is your take on the approach of another Microsoft employee doing code reviews? I mean, I don't know if there's anything specific for reviewing code of other Microsoft employees. I think a lot of the workplace related things kind of go into it, that, we be pragmatic, we meet folks where they're at. If I know somebody's kind of new to our team or even new to C Sharp. Like we've had some front end developers make that switch and they're incredibly brilliant in the front end, but they're just not as versed in the C Sharp language in the same way that I don't write fluent TypeScript. So kind of just meeting folks where they're at in terms of, those reviews and just having that empathy in terms of, might not be something that I'm super familiar with or that they'd be super familiar with either. Scrolling on my phone here, trying to see if there's I also see that I think I'm at time, so I'll follow up in the chat and figure the situation out and follow up with you folks async. So thank you all and hope you have a great rest of your conference. Thanks for your time.